Hey there, you cool cats and kittens, or as I usually say, greetings, scholars. I'd like to take a moment to discuss the other pathways and learning outcomes that I did not write up. I chose to do this as a video that was optional to use so that I did not have basically a page on web courses that was like incredibly long and text dense, okay? So if you would, please pause this video right now and minimize it and pull up on your computer screens the targeted learning outcomes that are discussed on the ENC 1102 webpage through the UCF Department of Writing and Rhetoric, which I gave you the link for, or if you want to pull up your syllabus, they are in there as well. So I already wrote about outcome 1, pathway 1, and when I reference the pathways, you'll see me go in order of the bullet points. They're not necessarily numbered, but for ease of you following along, I'll reference them in terms of outcome 1, pathway 2, etc. So outcome 1, we already basically talked about. We said that you're analyzing and synthesizing complex texts, which basically means that not only are you scrutinizing them for what are the main points, but you're also turning them into something else through synthesis, right? Complex texts for us, academic articles, the sources that you would have found for your annotated bibliography and Carr's Model Introduction, as well as the sources that you would have used for your academic articles. Not to mention, you were reading things in class that are considered complex. So possibly even the genre analysis and research proposal, where you would have incorporated some of these texts into helping you establish an argument and make your point, right? Okay, so that's outcome 1. We already talked about pathway 1. Pathway 2, the writing is intertextual, meaning that a conversation between texts and ideas is created in support of the writer's goals. So what might this mean? If you think back, what does intertextual mean? Intertextual means that writing does not occur in a vacuum. When you are an academic, you're creating something that is supposed to be contributing to existing conversation, right? If Stuart Green taught us nothing else, argument is conversation. If you're making an argument, you're actually making a conversation about a topic. And as you progress in your scholarly endeavors, you'll be writing and composing more to an audience that is in line with whatever you choose to do academically or professionally. So for now, we say writing is intertextual means that texts talk back and forth against each other. No one is writing a text for an audience of themselves only, okay? So where might you have witnessed that there's a conversation between text? Where may you have demonstrated that? And that would be in the annotated bibliography and Carr's Model Introduction, specifically in the Carr's Model Introduction. Now you can either point to the Carr's Model Introduction in that assignment, or you can look at it in the academic article. Perhaps you didn't get it right the first time, and so by the time the academic article came around, you realized that you had to present a framework of how what other scholars have done relates to your topic. You would have grouped them by shared point, right? You weren't just saying this author says this author says this. Instead, it was one main topic that authors are studying or looking at is this. Another topic that is shared amongst academics in this field is this. So that evidence of when that's happening, that is what you're looking at for this particular pathway. That's outcome 1, pathway 2. Outcome 1, pathway 3. The writer assessing the inquiry and writing choices of other writers to inform their own inquiry and writing decisions. So you're assessing the inquiry and writing choices of other writers. Where might you have done that, I ask you rhetorically? You would have done that in your annotations, right? You were determining what that author was presenting. You're determining the effectiveness of that particular thing. If there were any shortcomings in their research, you would have brought that up in your annotations. And you're using that to help you by the sentence that contextualized the end of each annotation that explained how you'd use that particular source for your research, right? Last pathway of outcome 1, writer responsibly using community-appropriate conventions for citation, for example, MLA or APA. This is a no-brainer in terms of one of the pathways that you can use to demonstrate mastery of this particular outcome would be through the citations that you did starting in your first major assignment, the genre analysis and research proposal, and moving all the way through to the end. So dealer's choice, pick one that you think you did it really, really well. Show me where you did that. Explain to me how you did that, and then use that for this particular pathway. Moving on to outcome 2. Students will engage in recursive, inquiry-based writing and research process that is meaningful for a specific community. Okay. Recursive means that it is a topic that is of your own origination. So recursive means that it's something that you reflected on and then chose to examine for inquiry. The inquiry-based writing, of course, is that you're doing an academic article that is research-based, but it's self-directed. I did not give you a topic and tell you you had to follow this particular path, but instead you determined the path that you wanted to take for your research. That is meaningful for a specific community. Well, remember all those times I told you this had to be a writing studies related paper, because for the purposes of what we are doing, we are only writing studies scholars, right? We're not psychology scholars, we're not engineering scholars, we're not, medical scholars. For the purposes of the writing we did here, we always had to keep that approach as being writing studies related. That's why I always had you build a strong foundation in terms of Dirk, Green, Savini, all of those things, right? So the specific meaningful community that you're engaged in here is the writing studies community, all right? So think about that. Where did we see that we were engaging with a writing studies community for our assignments? And let's look at the pathways. Pathway 1, the writer developing and framing a research question or problem that matters to a specific community. So where might you have drafted some research questions and justified why they were worth examining in one of the major assignments that we did? Perhaps in the genre analysis and research proposal, where you made connections with one of our assigned class readings. You had to have 3, right? With one of our assigned readings as to why you were justified in pursuing a particular line of inquiry based on what these other scholars have presented in terms of writing studies, okay? So that's the first one. The writer developing and framing a research question or problem that matters to a specific community. You're probably gonna find that in the genre analysis and research proposal. Pathway 2, the writer researching, developing, and employing community-appropriate research and analytical methods. You could point to the developing and employing of community-appropriate research in one of 2 places. One of them would be in the genre analysis and research proposal, where you explain to me how you're going to undertake your research and you give me justification as to why. The other one would be the methods section of your academic article, where you explain to me what you looked at, why you made those choices for those particular artifacts, okay? Pathway 3, the writer working flexibly and iteratively with primary and secondary research, including designing, adapting, and where necessary, revising research questions and methods given emergent discoveries. So in your academic articles, you are using both primary and secondary research. You used secondary research to establish the framework that would acquaint the reader as to how your primary research would fit into the existing academic conversation about your topic, right? And because you were tying in that connection to that foundation of writing studies, you're going to have done that there. So the CARS model introduction, move 2 was establishing your niche, right? Move 3 was occupying your niche. So those would be places that you could probably demonstrate that you were developing and framing a research question that mattered to a specific community. First, you had to explain what existing research was done with move 1, step 3, then move 2 is how does yours fit in, and then move 3 is what your research is specifically. Outcome 2, pathway 2. The writer researching, developing, and employing community-appropriate research and analytical methods. No, I'm sorry. We just did outcome 2, pathway 3. All right, sorry about that. I didn't mean to, let's rewind. Outcome 2, pathway 4, we're up to. The writer using and synthesizing multiple kinds of evidence gathered from various sources and genres like library research, interviews, surveys, observations, textual analysis, cultural artifacts, in order to support writing goals. So your academic article would be a good place to look for evidence of this if you choose this outcome and pathway. Basically, you've got the library research and then tied in with your observations and analysis of what you do in your methods section. So you could point me to that for evidence in that particular pathway. And finally, outcome 2, pathway 5, the writer demonstrating substantial and successive revision by creating successive drafts that show global improvement and or respond to substantive issues raised by instructor and peer feedback. Peer review would be an excellent place to showcase this. So you have turned in or submitted peer review worksheets and received back peer review worksheets. If you go to the feedback you received in your peer review worksheet, you can showcase how you made revisions to your final text based on the feedback you received from a peer review partner, okay? Or me. Okay, moving on to outcome 3. Students will be able to interpret their research findings in order to produce arguments that matter to specific communities by addressing real-world exigencies. Oh, you know this outcome is my favorite because it uses one of my favorite words, which is exigence. If everyone remembers what exigence is, dramatic pause, it is the reason for the writing, right? The purpose. Why did the author create this piece? What is the task it is attempting to accomplish? Okay, so outcome 3, pathway 1. The writer producing at least one argument that involves analysis, which is the close scrutiny and examination of evidence, assumptions, and counter-arguments in support of a larger set of ideas. Where might you have done that? In the academic article, right? Or even in the annotated bibliography and Carr's Mill introduction, but mostly the academic article because you're bringing together in the discussion section how your research fits into the conversation you established of existing research in the introduction, right? There should have been that section that you made connections between what you found and how that relates into what other people have talked about. Outcome 3, pathway 2, the writer persuasively articulating the stakes of at least one argument, meaning why what is being argued matters. Not one of my favorite pathways, but basically in the introduction of the academic article, in move 2, where you explain if you're either continuing the tradition, you're counterclaiming, or you're indicating a gap, that would be where you're talking about how what you have to argue matters in the grand scheme of things. So you could apply that for this particular pathway. Outcome 3, pathway 3, the writer demonstrating a clear understanding of the audience and why their argument matters to that audience with various aspects of the writing, mode of inquiry, content, structure, appeals, tone, sentences, and word choice being addressed and strategically oriented to that audience. So for this particular outcome and pathway, you want to show that you had a clear understanding of the audience and why it matters to that audience. If, as we determined in outcome 1, that the audience that we have discussed or that we've focused on this class being is that of a writing studies community, think about where you have demonstrated where you understand, you make those connections between writing studies and the thing that you're researching, right? So whether it's in the genre analysis and research proposal where you're making those connections between what is a genre from Dirk's perspective to the thing that you're looking at, or if you want to showcase where you have done that perhaps in the Carr's Mill introduction and the academic article, maybe in the discussion section of the academic article where you're bringing it back to how this particular thing matters to us, the audience of the writing studies community, those would be some places that you could probably make connections and show evidence of outcome 3, pathway 3. All right, last outcome. Outcome 4. Students will examine their own conceptions of writing and research in response to their inquiry, reading and writing throughout the course. Okay, So let's just think about this as for a moment, right? This is considering where you have examined your own conceptions of writing and research in response to the inquiry, reading, and writing throughout our class. All right, this is where we start to segue away from the traditional major assignments in terms of evidence of where you have done this. So where have we examined our thoughts on how what we're doing ties into our own conceptions of reading and writing and inquiry? Think about that for a moment. All right. Possible pathways include, and I want you to, all right, think about this. What else have we done for this class that was not a major assignment? There's your hint. What other work have we done? It doesn't have to be anything major. It could have been something we did in class. It could be something that we did that you turned in online. But think about all those other little assignments that we have done. And perhaps consider the e-portfolio, because we haven't finished that yet and it's still being worked on, and it has some components that will be applicable here, which we're going to have like an inception moment where it becomes so meta. Okay, we'll get there. So possible pathways. Outcome 4, pathway 1. The writer employing acquired vocabulary for discussing the roles that writing and research play in a given community. So where might you have written about and used the vocabulary to discuss the roles of writing and research in a given community? That one most likely would be your academic article. I know I said to forget about the major assignments for this section, but you could easily find places that you're employing the vocabulary for writing and research for this particular community for writing studies. Think about some other minor assignments. Go back, look at your minor assignments and see where you may have done this as well. Pathway 2, the writer considering the technologies and research methods that mediate writing, research, and the construction of knowledge. So perhaps if we think about technology and the construction of knowledge, perhaps the coding primary data activity that I had you do would satisfy this particular pathway, because you were not only utilizing technology, but you were considering the way the technology was used in order to create a piece of, to practice creating data that you would then use to support your writing goals. So the coding primary data activity could work here. Back to outcome 4, pathway 1 really quickly. I just remembered this particular assignment that I had you do, where you're employing acquired vocabulary for discussing the roles that writing and research play in a given community. Remember the writing assignment that I had you do where you had to make connections across texts, where you were required to take an argument from one text and then connect it to an argument from another assigned reading. It was all based off our assigned class readings. And I believe the title of the assignment was making arguments across, or making connections across texts. That would be a good way to demonstrate outcome 4, pathway 1 as well. Okay, so we did pathway 1, pathway 2, pathway 3. Outcome 4, pathway 3. The writer using acquired vocabulary for discussing their writing and research practices, including reflecting on their own writing situations using terms such as genre, discourse conventions, and rhetorical situation. Now you reflected on your own writing every time you did a reflection for a major assignment and turned it in. So you've already got that part done. You can point to any of those reflections that you did and show me how you were discussing your writing and research practices and what it meant for you to have that moment as a blossoming academic. Outcome 4, pathway 4. This is the inception moment of this particular assignment. The writer demonstrating a meta-awareness of their growth as a writer and researcher over time by reflecting on their writing and research practices and products and making claims about their learning. The introductory cover letter of the ePortfolio that I asked you to think about. Who are you as a writer? How has your writerly identity changed from week 1 until now? That particular assignment, that component of the ePortfolio is would make up outcome 4, pathway 4. So you're thinking about, where did I start? Where am I now? I would advise you to go back to the week 1 activity. It was the academic engagement activity where I had you think about what are your conceptions of writing as you start this class, and you can use that to help you springboard into, where was I then, where am I now, what has changed throughout. I know in particular, with everything going on right now, it's becoming increasingly difficult to even think about when we were all in the classroom together on week 1. It seems like that was a year ago. So that's why every semester I have you guys at the start take a little personal inventory of what are your conceptions about writing at this moment before we embark in the the voyage that is 1102. Okay. As always, if you have questions, I am happy to discuss this with you. You can either come to my virtual office hours, send me a message, or we can schedule an appointment. Happy writing. I hope this helps in understanding how you have met all these learning outcomes through these pathways. And if you think about it, I mean, I'm asking you to choose 2 pathways, but we have evidence that you have done something for every single pathway, for every learning outcome. And that's something I hope you can take a moment and really be proud of, because you did these things and they are measurable when they feel sort of unquantifiable, like writing. I wrote a paper. What does that mean? You did these measurable, demonstratable tasks. You have these skills now, that you have done these things and you know how to do these things. And I hope that you can take a moment and feel good about that. All right, guys, talk to you later.